He fought for his nation, but when he needed support, the system abandoned him. Until Trump arrived on the White House lawn, stretching wide beneath the bright midday sun. A sea of immaculate uniforms and gleaming medals sparkled in the light. It was a day of tradition, flags fluttering, speeches praising the armed forces, the national anthem echoing through the air, a tribute to duty, sacrifice, and patriotism. President Donald Trump stood at the heart of it all, shaking hands with generals, nodding as high-ranking officers expressed their thanks, exchanging courtesies with dignitaries. The cameras tracked his every move. Journalists scribbled notes, and the world observed. But then something diverted his attention. At the edge of the crowd, just beyond the official seating area, a solitary Marine stood apart. He wasn't slacking or disinterested. On the contrary, his posture was rigid, his uniform flawless, his medals perfectly aligned. Everything about him radiated discipline, but it was his eyes that caught Trump's gaze. There was something hidden there, a burden, a heaviness no decoration could erase. Trump had met countless servicemen and women before, but this was different. He turned slightly, signaling his aides and security to stay back. Then, without a word, he stepped away from the structured event and walked toward the Marine. The cameras hesitated, then swiveled sharply, capturing the moment. Sergeant Daniel Briggs stiffened as Trump approached. He had attended enough ceremonies to know the routine. The president would shake his hand, maybe say, "Thank you for your service," and move on. But as Trump stopped before him, there was no quick handshake, no rushed formalities. Instead, the president studied him, not as a politician sizing up a voter, but as one man assessing another, probing something deeper. Trump extended his hand. "What's your name, son?" Briggs hesitated briefly before replying. "Sergeant Daniel Briggs, sir." Trump gripped his hand firmly, holding it a moment longer than expected. His eyes remained fixed on Briggs's face. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," Trump said, his tone genuine, not rehearsed. "What's going on?" Briggs swallowed. He felt the weight of the cameras closing in. The Desensno, hundreds of eyes on him. He could play it safe, offer a polite response, and let the moment pass. But something about Trump's tone, the way he asked, the way he waited, made it impossible to deflect. Briggs exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure this is the right place." Trump shook his head. "Right place. Wrong place doesn't matter. Talk to me." Briggs hesitated again. Years of training had instilled in him the importance of composure. Marines didn't complain. Marines didn't make excuses. But here was the commander-in-chief, standing before him, asking him to speak. For the first time in years, he felt like someone in power truly wanted to listen. He took a slow breath, his eyes locking onto Trump's. Then, with the cameras rolling, the crowd silent, and the world watching, Sergeant Briggs began to speak. Sergeant Daniel Briggs had spent his entire career following orders, suppressing his emotions, and enduring pain. But standing there, face to face with the president, he felt something shift. This wasn't a press conference, nor a staged moment. Trump was looking at him, as if he expected a real answer. Briggs took a breath, his voice steady, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. "I've served 15 years, sir. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I've been in combat. I've lost friends. I've done my job, no complaints." His jaw clenched slightly before he continued. "But coming home, that's been the hardest part." Trump nodded slightly, listening. Not the way politicians usually did, distracted, waiting for their turn to speak. No, he was truly hearing him. Briggs exhaled, forcing himself to go on. "My wife, Naomish, is a nurse. Or, she was. Had to leave her job to care for our son. He was born with cerebral palsy. Needs full-time care." He paused, rubbing his thumb against his palm, the only sign of his frustration. "We tried everything. The VA, state assistance. Took months just to get someone on the phone. But the bills don't stop. The debt doesn't stop. I re-enlisted just to keep a paycheck coming, but now I'm up against it. We're drowning, sir." He hadn't meant to say that last part aloud, but there it was, out in the open. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Trump's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A deeper understanding, a recognition of something he'd seen before. Men who gave everything, only to return to nothing. Briggs swallowed hard. He wasn't seeking pity, nor asking for a handout. He just wanted to understand why it had to be this way. He forced himself to stand taller, pushing back against the raw emotion, threatening to surface. He was a Marine. Marines don't break. "I'm not asking for anything special," he said, his voice firm. "I just don't understand how a man can serve his country, risk his life for it, and come back to nothing." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably, the kind that made cameras zoom in, capturing every detail of the moment. Trump exhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. "You're telling me you've done your duty, and the government turned its back on you?" Briggs held his stare. "Yes, sir." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crowd, the press, the aides standing nearby, they felt it, the weight of the truth, the rawness of it. Trump turned slightly, glancing toward his team. A flicker of frustration crossed his face, but then resolve settled in. "Where's my chief of staff?" he called, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. An aide scrambled away, moving quickly. Briggs blinked. What was happening? He'd been in the system long enough to know how this worked. Politicians said they cared, made vague promises, then moved on. But this felt different. Trump turned back to him, his voice low but firm. "We're fixing this." And for the first time in years, Briggs felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The tension in the air thickened as a White House aide hurried off. The press pool had gone from routine coverage to full alert. Microphones extended, cameras zoomed in, and news producers whispered urgently into earpieces. Something was happening, something unscripted. Sergeant Daniel Briggs shifted slightly, his military training keeping his posture locked in place, but his mind raced. He'd expected a handshake, maybe a few polite words, not this. Not the president putting the entire system on notice. Right in front of the world. A few feet away, Trump crossed his arms, his expression unreadable as he studied Briggs. "You said you reached out to the VA," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "How long did it take to get a response?" Briggs clenched his jaw. 8 months, sir. And even then, they told us they were backlogged." The words sent a shockwave through the onlookers. 8 months. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably. The press leaned in closer. Even some of the military officials in attendance looked uneasy. Trump exhaled sharply. "That's not just incompetence. That's a disgrace." His words cut through the murmurs, slicing straight through the political noise. "We have billions for foreign aid, billions for useless government programs, and you're telling me we can't take care of the men and women who fought for this country?" The murmurs grew louder. A few feet away, Tony O'Brien, Trump's chief of staff, appeared, slightly out of breath. "Mr. President," Trump didn't take his eyes off Briggs. "This Marine has been hung out to dry. His kid has cerebral palsy. His wife had to quit working. The VA isn't doing a damn thing." O'Brien hesitated. "Sir, we..." Trump raised a hand, cutting him off. "No excuses. I want his case on my desk today. And I want a full audit of VA delays, every case like his, every soldier or Marine getting screwed over. I want names, numbers, reports be tonight." O'Brien nodded quickly and stepped away, already pulling out his phone. Briggs stood in stunned silence. He'd spent years buried under government red tape, ignored by agencies that moved at a glacial pace. Now, in less than 2 minutes, the president had thrown the entire system into motion. Trump turned toward the gathered press, his voice clear and unwavering. "We say we support our troops. We love to say it. But what the hell does that mean? If we let them come home to this? If a man is willing to lay down his life for this country, then this country better damn well take care of him when he gets back. The statement hit hard. Some of the reporters, even the ones used to grilling him, paused. Because this wasn't politics. This was personal. Trump looked back at Briggs. You said you weren't asking for handouts. Good, because you shouldn't have to. He extended his hand again. I don't forget people. We're fixing this. Today. Briggs hesitated for a half second before taking the handshake. His grip was firm, but his mind reeled. A handshake wasn't supposed to mean anything, but this one did. And as the press scrambled to capture the moment, one thing became crystal clear. This story was just getting started. The moment the handshake happened, the press lost control. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Reporters shouted over one another, and news producers scrambled to push the footage live. The planned coverage of the military appreciation event had just turned into something much bigger. "Mr. President," a reporter shouted, "do you think this is political grandstanding? Will this actually lead to change? Or is this just a public stunt?" Another chimed in, "What about the VA's budget? Where's the funding going to come from?" Trump, still gripping Briggs's hand, turned slightly toward the press, but didn't let go. His voice cut through the frenzy. "I don't give a damn about how this looks," he said, his eyes locking onto a CNN correspondent. "I care about results. This man served his country. His family is suffering, and I'm not letting bureaucrats bury this in paperwork while his kid suffers." The reporters froze for half a second, just long enough for the weight of his words to land. Then they went into overdrive. Every major network broke into live coverage, their talking heads scrambling to analyze what had just happened. Some called it raw leadership, a sign that Trump was taking real action. Others branded it a calculated PR stunt, designed to rally his base ahead of an election cycle. Fox News ran the headline, "Trump goes to war for veterans. Demands VA overhaul on the spot." CNN countered with, "Trump uses struggling Marine as political prop. Is this real reform or a stunt?" MSNBC featured a panel debating whether this was a genuine call to action or just another headline moment that would fade by next week. But outside the media bubble, something else was happening. For the first time in years, veterans across the country started speaking up. Former Army Ranger Mike Ramirez posted a viral tweet, "Sergeant Briggs isn't alone. I spent a year fighting the VA just to get my PTSD treatment approved. This system is broken." A Navy widow, Jessica McAdams, shared a heartbreaking post about her late husband, who had died waiting for medical care. The VA didn't just fail him, it killed him. Within hours, hashtags like #FixTheVA and #VeteransDeserveBetter trended nationally. And while social media exploded, a storm was brewing behind the scenes. At VA headquarters, top officials panicked. Calls poured in from the White House. High-ranking administrators were summoned for late-night emergency meetings. The pressure was mounting, and there was nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, inside his Arlington home, Sergeant Briggs sat at his kitchen table, watching the news with his wife Naomi. She hadn't said much since the footage aired, but now her fingers tightened around his hand, her expression unreadable. "You realize what you've started, right?" she whispered. Briggs exhaled slowly. "I didn't start anything. I just told the truth." Naomi shook her head. "No, Daniel. You did something nobody else had the courage to do." She met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "You made them listen." But while the nation debated and veterans found their voices, a hidden war had already begun. One that could either cement real change or destroy everything before it even started. The clip of Trump and Sergeant Briggs went viral overnight. It wasn't just political junkies watching, it was everyone. The clip played on morning news shows, was dissected in opinion columns, and dominated online discussions. Cable networks fought for control of the narrative. Fox News labeled it the moment Washington finally took veterans seriously. CNN framed it as a carefully orchestrated political move. MSNBC asked, "Will this actually lead to change? Or just another flash in the pan?" But outside the television screens and headlines, something else was happening. Veterans, hundreds of thousands of them, began speaking out on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Stories poured in. A former Marine, Greg Lawson, shared, "I was medically discharged with a spinal injury. Took me 2 years to get the VA to approve surgery. We're treated like we're disposable." A National Guard widow, Ashley Carter, posted a thread about her husband, who had died by suicide after waiting 14 months for mental health treatment. "I begged them to see him sooner. Begged. They told us to be patient." Within 48 hours, hashtags like #FixTheVIA and #Veterans Deserve Better trended at #1 nationwide. For the first time in years, veterans weren't just complaining in private, they were uniting. Inside Washington, panic set in at VA headquarters. A late-night emergency meeting was called. The conference room was packed. Officials, bureaucrats, political aides, all scrambling for answers. "We need a statement," one official said, sweating under the fluorescent lights. "Something that says we're handling this." "Handling this?" another snapped. "We've got the president demanding full reform, a national firestorm on our hands, and veterans calling us criminals." Meanwhile, at the White House, Trump's Oval Office desk was covered in stacks of veteran case files. Some were stories, just like Briggs's, months, even years of delays. Others were worse. Veterans who had died waiting for care. Families who had lost everything fighting the system. Trump sat back, flipping through a file, shaking his head. "This is worse than I thought." Tony O'Brien, his chief of staff, shifted uncomfortably. "The VA has been broken for decades. Too much bureaucracy. Too much wasted money." Trump's fingers drummed on the desk. "Who's responsible for this mess?" O'Brien hesitated. "Technically, the VA secretary." But Trump cut him off. "Fire him." O'Brien exhaled. "Mr. President, that's complicated. Firing a cabinet member over this will send shockwaves through the administration." Trump's stare didn't waver. "Good, maybe those shockwaves will wake people up." The next morning, news broke. Trump fires VA secretary in shock move. Promises immediate reform. The media erupted. Some called it reckless. Others called it bold leadership. But among veterans, the reaction was different. For the first time in a long time, they saw something real. Something that wasn't just words. Back at the Briggs home, Sergeant Briggs sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. His face was illuminated by the glow of the screen. Message after message poured in. Some were from fellow Marines, thanking him for speaking up. Others were from reporters, begging for an exclusive interview. And then there were the threats, anonymous emails, voicemails, calling him a pawn, a sellout, a liar. He clenched his jaw. He'd faced enemy fire overseas. But this was something else. Naomi sat beside him, arms crossed. "You're not reading those, are you?" Briggs didn't answer. She exhaled, reaching for his hand. "Listen to me. You didn't ask for this, I know that. But you did start something." Her voice softened. "And now you have to decide. Do you keep fighting, or do you walk away?" His phone buzzed again, a call from the White House. Briggs exhaled. He already knew what was coming. He answered, "Yes, sir." Trump's voice was direct. "I need you in Washington tomorrow." Briggs hesitated. "Mr. President, No excuses," Trump interrupted. "I want you in the room when we overhaul the VA. You started this fight, and you're going to help me finish it." Briggs felt his heart hammer in his chest. He was just a Marinino, a politician. But walking away now, that wasn't an option. And as he boarded a plane to Washington the next morning, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every veteran who had ever been forgotten. And this time, they weren't going to be ignored.